Hi, I'm Daniela Cruz, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, and our interviewer, Kay Yoland, speaks with curator Philipp Kaiser about their exhibition, Disappearing California, circa 1970, Bas Jan Ader, Chris Burden, Jack Goldstein. Now for Art This Week.
Welcome to Art This Week. I'm Kay Yoland, and today I'm talking at the Modern with the curator Philipp Kaiser. The exhibition we'll be discussing is Disappearing California circa 1970. It features three artists, Bas Jan Ader, Jack Goldstein, and Chris Burden. So thank you, Philipp, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, to just start off with an introductory question for our audience to kind of bring them into the work, I'm curious of how and why you decided to curate these three artists.
Well, I organized a few years ago a Jack Goldstein retrospective, and at the end, after spending all this time working on the retrospective, I realized how much his work was, from the very beginning to the bitter end, where he committed suicide, was or has been obsessed with disappearance. But it wasn't so much disappearance as a theme, it was more disappearance as a paradigm in his work. It had to do obviously with conceptual art, with him wanting to disappear as the author, and that's kind of the starting point. How I thought this is like a topic or a trope that is able to describe a very specific moment in California conceptualism in the early 70s. And you could turn the entire thing into a group exhibition, but I felt with more artists. But the three artists that I included, they were, especially at that time in the 70s, obsessed with disappearance. And it had, of course, multiple reasons that we can talk about. But I think, in this sense, disappearing is like a case study of early California conceptualism.
And in terms of disappearing, what that term can mean, it can be vanishing, or it can be self-effacement, erasure, it can be a violence, it can also be an act of modesty, in a way sinking back. And I'm thinking of maybe Goldstein's having his assistants sign the paintings rather than himself in later works. What do you think the value of those relationships are, the kind of the different ways disappearing can be seen, the relationship between that and self-effacement, for example?
I think when you walk through the exhibition, it really becomes clear on how many levels the artists disappear. And one question you have is, of course, what triggers them to think about that. And as I mentioned, it has to do with I think the institutionalization of conceptualism, that the artist would think about, the disappearance of the art object, the disappearance of the artist subject. Then, of course, they were all facing the threat of being drafted for a war. They had a very physical, I think they had a physical threat of leaving the country and fight somewhere. But at the same time, I also felt it's an interesting moment in time to think about the disappearance of the white male subject and the appearance of feminism that happened at exactly the same time. So disappearing is many things, It describes this moment of a new generation that comes out of these new art schools that were established in California and started around 1970. There was UC Irvine, where Chris Burden studied. There was CalArts, which kind of put Los Angeles on the map for the first time in history, where John Baldessari taught, Alan Capro, and many others, and where in 1971, also a year after it opened, the feminist art program got established. And I think it was this fertile ground and the generation of young, bold, super confident artists, egomaniac artists, who were trying to push it so hard and to go so much further than the preceding generation.
And the third school would be the Claremont College?
The third school, Bas Jan Ader, is 3 years older than Jack Goldstein. So we would consider them the same generation. Jack Goldstein always said, you're like an older generation. Right. Maybe it was the habit how he was dressed, and he felt like an emigre from Europe when he walked around in his tweed suit and carried books. But he studied at Otis College, and Otis College was, which is interesting, it's a history that no one talks about, but Otis College, and interestingly enough, Mary Sue, the widow and the former wife of Bas Jan Ader, who filmed a lot of his pieces, her dad was the president of Otis, and Otis was a highly diverse school. When you talk about diversity in Southern California, CalArts was more or less, when it comes to the arts, to the art class, purely white, while Otis College had Charles White and some other African American artists and was much more inclusive. But it feels like it's still like the tail end of another history of late modernism. It had the diversity, but it didn't have this cutting edge conceptualist agenda that CalArts had.
Well, so, I mean, briefly, we've got, as you said, we've got 3 artists coming from 3 different schools, but close enough in location, the same state. How do artists such as Baldessari, who at one point, did this great performance of burning his earlier work, so in a way disappearing from the mark making of his previous self, and maybe Judy Chicago and feminism, did the 2 of them influence that group of artists, or our 3 artists of this exhibition, or was it more Baldessari, or were they just circulating kind of through osmosis, do you think?
No, I think that's a good question. I think Baldessari, the cremation project, Baldessari was a teacher in San Diego. He burned all his former paintings that he did between 1953 and 66 and said, this is over. And then he went to CalArts. It happened right before he started.
Oh, I thought it was as he arrived in CalArts.
Or as he arrived. It's kind of like the beginning of that.
It's a new chapter.
It's a new chapter, and it has like an irony and a radical impulse that's, I think, remarkable. And I think when you think of Jack Goldstein, who was a student in the first class, who would bury himself that was his MFA piece in 1972. In the summer, he would bury himself on the location of the CalArts campus. And John said this was one of the most radical performances. And I think, obviously, the live burial had to do with Houdini and with other things, with like putting yourself at danger, playing with death. But it also had to do with Baldessari, obviously, because Jack was obsessed with John. He always wanted to get John's nod. And I think John said at some point, Jack would have cut off his hand to get my approval. So I think John's influence in Southern California can't be estimated high enough. I talked to, when it comes to feminism, it's interesting, there was some crossing between the early classes, the so-called post-studio class of Baldessari. There was the big feminist group. There was also a big Fluxus group that no one really talks about. There was Alison Knowles and others at early CalArts. But I think when I talked to Judy, it was obvious that there was some maybe subconscious appropriation of feminist performances to deal, that dealt with the body and with endangerment, and I felt there is some overlap. And art history has tried over the years, to separate these two and to say this is Chris Burden, who was always obsessed with his ego and its macho art, and they're the feminists on the other side. And I think when you talk to the protagonist of this early hour of feminism, of the first generation, you see how much more complicated the history was. For example, Barbara T. Smith, who was a very famous and known feminist artist of the first generation, she and Chris were very close friends. She did this performance in San Francisco called Feed Me, where she was naked in a room and you had to walk into the room and you could do whatever you wanted to do with her. And she said Chris came in there and he didn't really know what to do. But I think what's interesting is that they shared, the performance group, they shared and appreciated each other much more than art history now admits. But I also think when I say that, I also have to say it was also California, because in California, the borders were more blurry. People were supportive of each other. It didn't really matter if you were, if you were in which fraction you were, you would appreciate each other. It was more like the critics who wrote the art history on the East Coast and who were very dismissive about some of these works.
And wanted to categorize them and create these kind of tribal camps, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so talking about their relationship, I mean, so you've said that they appreciate these other artists like Baldessari and feminist artists. When I was reading your catalogue essay, you touched on their relationships, and like 2 of them, Goldstein and Ader, have a friendship, and then Burden admires Ader. Ader's not so sure about Burden. Goldstein likes Burden's work, and there's all this it's a really interesting tension and maybe friction, and also maybe love affair at a distance. And I'm wondering, Do you think they consciously couldn't get too close with their work, like because their work maybe overlapped? Or I mean, why not have a movement together? Why not have some kind of collective? Why keep this distance, but also this sort of admiration club for each other?
No, that's an interesting question because it's really convoluted and complicated. And I think Burden, you know, they are the same generation, even if Jack thought that he was 3 years older and it belongs to a different generation. Chris was, I remember when he was still alive when I worked, I included a big piece exposing the foundation of the museum. We did this, we restaged the piece from the 80s at the museum in LA, and I talked to him about Jack Goldstein. I was working on this show, and I had this idea or this fascination with disappearance. And he would pretend not even to know. He said, Jack who? And I said, Jack Goldstein. Jack who? And he wouldn't say, you know, he wouldn't acknowledge that he knew him. But, you know, I have to say, they were pretty independent, but there are some overlaps. You know, it was a really small art scene. You know, Chris Burden was immediately published in Avalanche magazine that Willoughby Sharp published. Bas Jan Ader gave one interview in there, so he was in there. Jack Goldstein, who was, and I think this is maybe the person who brings all the strings and everything together. It's like Helene Weiner, who now runs Metro Pictures, but she was the director of the Pomona Museum of Art, and she was showing the 3 artists for the first time, and she was also dating, that's a little gossip, but she was also dating Jack Goldstein for 8 years. So she was like the sun in this orbit of like the artists circling around her, but I felt they all established a very independent rhetorics, an independent attitude, but I'm more interested in what they, you know, I think they weren't, she said last night when we had the conversation, she said, you know, I didn't know that the attitude was so strong. Now I look back over 45 years and you look back where the work situates itself, you see how the work touches each other. And I was also interested in the show. I wasn't interested in showing, you know, who was first, and then he looked at it and then he did this piece. There are these magical constellations in the exhibition that you can't even tell or verify if they knew about each other at the same time. And obviously, Jack and Bas Jan Ader, they were closer. Jack, you know, would show Bas Jan Ader's work in his studio, even if they were a little reserved. And Burden was like on his own,
doing his thing.
But you know, but Bas Jan Ader, when Burden did like the shoot performance in '71, that's, you know, and then he left UC Irvine, and then 2.5 years later, Bas Jan Ader starts to teach at UC Irvine. Everybody in Southern California knew about that performance piece, also in New York. So he knew about Chris Burden, and he said also in one of the very few interviews, I don't do body art, I don't do performance, you know, so he felt he's doing something else.
Yeah.
Then what is it, you know?
I was wondering about that. That was going to be a question. This, the clear statement and really wanting to distance yourself from the term performance art. You know, would he prefer to describe his work as actions? And also, why did he need to distinguish himself from it? Did he even not want to be seen as an artist? Was it something else that he wanted to kind of encompass with his work?
Well, he was very interested in like philosophy, and you know, when he went after Otis, he went to Claremont and he studied philosophy. So he was interested in bigger ideas. He had like a bigger agenda, even if the films are extremely simple. You know, it's like a before and after. There's a transition that happens, the fall, for example. And everybody, you know, Bill Levitt would say fall and failing, fall and death. You know, that's so important in his work, and yes, it is, but it's also about someone who's visible and then he's invisible. You know, he lands in a, so it kind of, you see, and I didn't mean, when I did the exhibition, I didn't want to, you know, project the misery of his death that had to do with disappearance. When we have the same end when it comes to Jack Goldstein's work, project that on their practice. I think it was really like thinking out of their practice. But
yeah, I guess for the listeners, just to say, yes, that Bas Jan Ader, actually, his last piece, he didn't survive his last work when he sailed off to arrive from the US to Plymouth in England. He never arrived, and also Jack Goldstein, he ended up taking his own life later on. Maybe just thinking about Bas Jan Ader's father and his death, his murder, but also maybe Jack Goldstein's suicide later on. I'm just wondering about, I mean, I know we're not projecting this on the work, but also how like disappearance can be a violence. And
absolutely.
I'm thinking with Chris Burden's, I've forgotten the name, forgive me, when he's locked in the locker.
5-day locker piece.
5-day locker piece with Bas Jan Ader's fall down the house from the roof, and with Jack Goldstein's Buried Alive. There's something incredibly dangerous about these pieces in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a violence there that may be self-afflicted, but at the same time carries some resonance with maybe world politics, with the violence of, you know, others upon you, the execution of Bas Jan Ader's father. Do you think these violence is something they're thinking about, or that's what I project?
No, absolutely. I think death was like omnipresent at the time, and I just, you know, I think you can say, well, they were all a little suicidal, and that's why the show, you know, that's where the show started. But obviously, I think, you know, it has many reasons. I talked about conceptualism. It has to do with a very specific interest in the sublime that all three artists have. And the sublime, I mean, getting lost in totality has to do with a death desire in a way. I mean, that's where it starts. It's
fear and attraction to it at the same time.
An attraction of getting lost completely as an enjoyment. But at the same time, death is much more direct in being addressed in pieces like the 5-day locker piece, for example, where Chris Burden, and that's his MFA piece at UC Irvine, he would lock himself into this 2x2 by 3 foot locker, one of the university lockers, and the performance started at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Monday morning, and then it ended on Friday at 5 p.m. when the work week ends. And he had like a tank with water with a few gallons on top of him, and then below he had an empty tank, and he would be in there, and it's so radical that he really put himself at risk. And of course he was also thinking about the tiger cages they used in Vietnam at the same time. I think death is, in Bas Jan Ader's work, it's maybe more obvious because it is, many pieces are grounded on the fall of his own dad, you know, dad's death, who was executed by the Nazis shortly before the war in a very tragic way in a forest. With some others. And so in a big slide projection that you see at the very beginning of the show, you can see him mimicking the trees, and he's like hiding as if he was a tree, and then mimicking, you know, how they, you know, from left to right, you have a before and after, life and death. You see him lie on the ground with the logs. And I think even if you don't know this context, and what's interesting, Helene Weiner, for example, who showed the piece for the first time in Pomona in 1972, she said, Bas Jan Ader didn't tell me the story about his dad by then, so we didn't know about that. So, but even if you don't know about that, you know there is like a harsh before and after, and the death, life and death, it's like everything, you know, it's a totality of like yes and no, black and white, it's everything, and life and death. And I think that's the remarkable thing, that they were highly aware of a very specific historic moment in politics, and at the same time created something that was like for eternity. You know, they kind of combined that with no ahistorical sense.
I think my final question kind of goes from that the idea of it, the history of it, and to where we are now. I think, you know, we can have these contexts that they are responding to in their time period, but it also feels very relevant to now. And I'm wondering what you think are some of the kind of takeaways to what's going on in the world right now, and how this work maybe dialogues with it.
Well, you know, it's interesting when I said in the beginning that we're dealing with 3 white male artists that are disappearing at the time when feminism got established or institutionalized. It's interesting, the white man hasn't disappeared.
No, I was just he's definitely,
you know, it's
not
the opposite.
Yeah, no, he's still very much
he reappeared even more powerful. Maybe it's you know, it's a desperate power, you know, or a desperate presence. And I think it just makes us think about that, you know, how specific you're facing history at a certain moment in time. Also, when we think, for example, at this piece that we have behind us, The Reason for the Neutron Bomb, you see like 50,000 nickels with a little match on top of it, representing a tank. And Chris Burden, when he made this piece, it was the first big installation in '79. He was thinking about, I mean, it's like a sublime landscape of warfare and capitalism in a way, because every single nickel represents a tank behind the Iron Curtain that was there. And you see his work, and you see that in the exhibition, how it goes from the artist's body, through the artist's identity, through collective apocalypse, and through collective disappearance in a way. And that's kind of where the show ends. And I think Burden's work has always dealt with the violence, on the impact of violence on his body, on his mind, and I feel we live in a very violent time, even if we don't have the warfare at the moment.
But there's the threat of it, isn't it? And
yeah,
now,
absolutely.
I mean, it's interesting the size of these, because with artificial intelligence and drones, now things we are talking about, things could be that small and could enter into, you know, a room and be almost invisible. So the scale is also kind of an interesting one for contemporary technological moment we're in.
Absolutely, and what's interesting also about the installation is when you know, it's owned by the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and when you get that piece, when you borrow the piece, they only bring you the template. So you have to get all the nickels, you have to buy them at the bank. That means you have to get involved with the politics.
Action of actually,
absolutely.
The transaction with the bank.
The transaction, and then after the piece is, you know, after the show is over, we have to bring back the money. So you get involved, there's no escape.
Yeah.
And I think that's maybe also telling about what does the show say about now. You know, we're all involved in it, we're all part of it if you want it.
We're implicit,
Absolutely.
True. Well, on that note, on the reflection of our own implicit relationship to it, thank you so much for joining us today.
Very welcome. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you.
We want to thank Philipp for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to themodern.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.